we're incredibly fortunate to have Lucy Kalanithi here. I don't know if you know, but the book, When Breath Becomes Air, is #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It was #1 last week. It's had an amazing launch in America. It's going to be, I think, at the top of the bestseller list. It was only published here, last week? And it's going to be phenomenally popular here. There isn't a bookstore, I think, in America or England that wouldn't want to have her here this evening. So we're very, very, very lucky to have her and to be able to talk with her about the book. It's a fantastic book. Someone that I like a lot, Gavin Francis, said of it that it's a tremendous book, crackling with life, animated by wonder, and by the question of how we should live. And that's absolutely right. I was thinking that some of you will know the book. Some of you will have read excerpts from the book and perhaps have heard Lucy speak about it. But there's many of you will not. And I thought we might begin by just, you could tell us a bit about how the book came to be written.
Sure. And thank you so much for talking with me and welcoming me, and thanks for having me here tonight. And I think, when you say bookstores would love to have me visit, I think what brings tears to my eyes is I know what you're saying is that they would love to have Paul visit. And it's amazing because I'll give some background in a second, but that blurb for the book from Gavin Francis where he says, crackling with life. When my husband wrote this book, he didn't appear to be crackling with life. He was writing, wrapped in a blanket, often wearing a hat and gloves inside, undergoing chemotherapy, looking very frail and wan. But internally and intellectually and emotionally, he was very, very alive. And so to hear the book described as crackling with life is just really incredible, because that's sort of how I feel about it. And what he really meant to do. And so you said how the book came to be, or how describe the book. So the book is a memoir. It's written by my late husband, Paul Kalanithi, who was a neurosurgeon, who also had a background in English literature and history and philosophy of science, and who was very interested in the question, sort of from a literature and neuroscience point of view, and philosophical point of view, what makes us human, what makes a meaningful life, and what how do we sort of seek and live our values? And we're all kind of struggling to do that. And he himself had thought about it a lot, including as a neurosurgeon helping patients through crises. And then he himself at 36 was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, a very rare type of lung cancer that it was immediately obvious to both of us as doctors was terminal. And so he came up against the question of mortality very directly. And so this book is his processing of that.
I mean, do you think that being doctors made you, and also Paul's knowledge of literature and all the kind of person that he was, do you think it made the two of you uniquely prepared to think about these things? About the issues
it was
of
kind
life
of right, yeah. It was kind of the best and worst thing, I think. I think overall, yes. We knew right away, we got the news that he had cancer. We were alone in his hospital room, and he typed in his hospital credentials. He was a patient at the time, suddenly a patient, but in the hospital where he worked as a surgeon. And he typed in his hospital credentials, and we pulled up the CAT scan images, and we looked at them together and knew right away what we were looking at, cancer in his organs and in his bones. And so we knew right away, we could both see kind of the landmark stretching ahead of us, sort of debility and death, while at the same time suddenly being completely disoriented because now it was happening to us. And the thing that I feel thankful for is that maybe because of being doctors, we sort of didn't have to wrestle with the question of why me. Paul says in the book, well, the answer to that question would be, why not me? Because we've both sort of seen this happen to our patients. so I think that sort of gave us some grounding and some even inspiration, having seen other people face this type of thing. Yeah.
The way you do it is unique, and for those of you that haven't read the book, it's an amazing journey. One of the things that I love about the book is it is like all great books. It isn't just this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Paul takes you through how he's thinking about things, and it's a portrait of his, inner thoughts and feelings through the whole process. And so it's an incredible journey for him, but also for the reader reading the book. Makes it a remarkable book. One of the things that's remarkable, and I was wondering if you could talk about it a bit, was the decision to have a baby together.
Yeah. So we decided to have a baby despite the fact that Paul had a terminal illness. And at first it obviously seemed kind of crazy. We'd had always planned to have a child around the time that he finished his training as a neurosurgeon, and I had finished mine as an internist. And right around that time was when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And initially it kind of seemed crazy to even consider that question. And, I think we ended up asking ourselves perhaps the same questions that anybody asks themselves when they decide to have a baby, which is something like, is this meaningful to me? And do I think I can provide this child a good life? And so we thought, I think we can still say yes, despite the fact that Paul has metastatic cancer. But I did ask him, and he writes about this in the book. I said, don't you think that having a child will make your death more painful because you'll be needing to say goodbye to a child? And he said, wouldn't it be amazing if it did? And he sort of had this idea, and we agreed that life is about creating meaning. It's not just about avoiding suffering. And I think, so we have a daughter. She's now actually been around longer without Paul even than with Paul, and she's 19 months. She was 8 months old when he died. And she's doing very well, and she's lovely. And I think it was a really good decision. And we certainly need our family and community, to help me and help her. But that was a tough but considered decision.
It's interesting because I wrote The Examined Life when I was 50, and I just had my children. And one of the things which was I was conscious of that my mother had died by the time she's the age that I am now, 63. My father had had 2 heart attacks. And I think there's a relationship for some writers, not all, but for some writers, between mortality and having children and the desire to write, to try and I felt this was in the book, that, as I said, that he wasn't just telling a story, but he was giving your daughter a picture of his mind and how he thought about things, who he was and how he felt about things. It's very beautiful. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, and when I'm just curious too about when did he come to start writing, and was it before? Was it tied up with the wish to get pregnant? And
I think you're right about what you're getting at. The idea that this book is a journal, and then it's also written for a reader. And then it's also written for a particular reader, which is the older version of Katie, whenever she chooses to read it. And I'll sort of have to leave that up to her and let her kind of guide her, but let her develop her own idea of, the idea of Paul and her relationship with Paul. But it's sort of a prized possession, as you can imagine, to pass on to her. And then, with regard to the timing of his writing, I became pregnant in October of 2013. He had been diagnosed in May of 2013. So May, and then I was pregnant in October. And in January, he wrote an essay that was published in the New York Times called How Long Have I Got Left? And he talks about the pain of uncertainty that comes with having an illness. Even if it's terminal, there's still a lot of uncertainty, which itself is painful. And out of that, he came into contact with a literary agent and then an editor, and it was thrilling. And he was becoming too debilitated to work as a surgeon, which initially he had continued doing while ill. And then sort of as his surgical career evaporated, he started sort of furiously writing this memoir. And and that's the point at which he was becoming sicker and sicker, but remaining very connected through the book. But most of the book was written between January 2014 and then when he died, which was in March of 2015, was when he was writing.
Interesting. I mean, when you put it that way, as you were talking, I was thinking about the question of intimacy, and did you ever feel, that he was giving something to the book that he wasn't giving to you, or the way that, which is a usual thing for people who write and their families, and the struggle always that when you're in a writing state of mind, you're sort of cut off from the people you love, but with them on the page. So he's with Katie in some future thing and involved with that, but it can mean that someone's absent too. How was that? I mean,
it felt like the opposite, actually,
right.
Thankfully, because I was reading the book as he wrote it. So, meaning sort of daily or weekly, I would see what he had put down, and oftentimes he would be writing something in the book that was in a way more intimate than something he was than what he was verbalizing. So we were spending all this time together because he wrote it like next to me, often, lying in bed or sitting, or Katie's there. So sort of like physically intimate writing process because we were in the same space. And I was on maternity leave for a while and then on family leave to care for him. Weirdly, I'm happy to be able to say it was kind of the opposite. It was sort of a communication tool.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I really like about the book is that Paul lets the reader know that he can be completely maddening, that he can upset you, that he's honest in a particular way, and that actually draws us more deeply to like him, because we're all maddening and we all drive. It's the thing that I believe that all relationships are, at some point or another, disappointing. We're disappointed in people we love, and they're disappointed in us, and he conveys that, and so it does feel, in a way I could see that, you could feel more intimate, but it must have been hard too.
Yeah, it's funny because even, this sounds cheesy, but like even thinking about the ways in which he was maddening, it's like I miss those things too, now that he's not here. So let that be a lesson to you all in your own relationships.
I mean, I wondered to what extent are normal relationships, ups and downs, important, and even desirable during this whole journey. I mean, that there was a way in which holding on to a normal aspect, even those sorts of things, that it wasn't idealized but that it was a real relationship, and there were things that the two of you were struggling about.
Yeah, that's right. He writes in the beginning of the book how we had been sort of having this rocky patch in our marriage right before he was diagnosed. It all came to a head, and I'm happy that all of that got out on the table right before he was diagnosed, because it would have been hard to deal with both of those at once, and instead it was like everything got laid bare, and then everything got laid really bare, and but like you say, then it's really intimate because it's really real. And with regard to normalcy, like we continued to really enjoy each other and make jokes. The jokes just turned to different subjects. We had nicknames for his medications, or we one of the things that we both found most helpful was that ability to continue to be authentic, and people who came to visit when Paul was sick, who continued to make jokes, or who continued to maintain the types of relationships or rapport or communication style or jokes or just whatever, making fun of each other, making fun of Paul. If they had before, they continued doing it after he got sick. And Paul said, it's being sick makes you feel isolated, and when you don't feel like yourself and you're sick, that's very isolating. So I think that's exactly right. That authenticity, I think, is actually very consoling or healing in a way. Yeah.
I think I said, like, those are the things which I love in the book, and I think are really so very important. What are the things that you think are important in the book, and what are the messages? Or, I mean, I thought the bit that you quoted a little while ago about life isn't about avoiding suffering, but about finding meaning, is just a fantastic thought. And it's one of the things which I came away from. But what are the things that you would like readers to see in the book and hear?
I'm even sort of like mixing it up a little bit with what I think about what I want our daughter Katie to like see and hear from the book. But I think some of the pieces that are sort of essential are what you've just mentioned, and kind of related to that, Paul found very important sort of the concept of striving. And he didn't just mean like striving to attain a degree or whatever. He meant like striving to be a good person and striving to do the right thing and striving to become better and more skillful at what you're attempting to do. And he talks about literature and language as almost sort of like supernatural forces that bring us together and help us share common experiences. Like when I first met him and fell in love with him, he was talking about this poem or this metaphor about the idea of people being circles that touch at edges. So we meet at these little points where we can communicate through language. And I think you talk about this idea in your book, like you can, if you put something into words, you gain a certain ability to find meaning or share meaning or cope. To distill it, sort of a portion of the book is about the influence that literature and language have in sort of making us human and connecting us to each other. And then I think Paul, especially for a young person, was sort of obsessed with death is the wrong way to say it. As it's coming out of my mouth, I realize it's not even what I mean. But he was really interested in death as sort of a philosophical and intellectual problem, and certainly not everybody has to be, but he then faced it sort of emotionally and existentially. And I think this idea of facing the fact that we're all mortal, and what do we do with that fact, and how do we build meaning either despite or because of that, is an important part of the book. And I think that's actually something that people are responding to that, for exactly the reason that Paul wanted to share it. And I think we all are sort of interested in this conversation about how do we live and die well, and how do we take care of each other. And so I think it does seem that people are responding to that, and it's starting conversations, and along with a number of other really important books in this area. So I think that's the exciting part.
I was thinking, I agree with that. I think those are things which I thought when I read the book. And, one of the things, at the beginning we were talking about you being both a doctor and a widow, but I thought there are other things that you're struggling with, I felt as well, with, such as mourning, which I think of acceptance of the loss of someone we love. And at the same time, here we are, and you're, helping bring his book into the world, which is keeping his voice alive. And maybe we could talk just about some of those things, which I think are really just what that feels like. And
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and it's like the way you're phrasing that question, there are sort of like these dualities kind of, and there was a book review in the New York Times where Janet Maslin wrote something like, this book is indelible, which is like an amazing thing to read about a book. And then I think, this book is indelible, what an incredible thing to say. And then at the same time, Paul is dead. So he's indelible and dead. Which is really, that like strikes me with a force, obviously. And then it's kind of this similar disorienting sensation to be carrying his book forward while also going alone. And then there's the experience of, like the public experience of the book and the personal experience of bereavement. And they're kind of mixed together. as an example, I did a radio interview a few weeks ago in California, and then left that studio to go to finalize the text for Paul's headstone. And so it's sort of these weird, sort of shocking juxtapositions of personal and private. But then at the same time, even the act of sitting here with you, talking to you, is public. But then it also feels really consoling and personal, and an important, wonderful thing for me emotionally to be doing, because 11 months after your husband dies, it's not usually the case that almost everyone you meet wants to talk about your husband. And for me personally, it's actually like really wonderful and teaches me something about what to potentially offer to somebody who's grieving. So it's like wonderful and terrible at the same time.
I was wondering, would you read from the book a little
Sure.
bit? That would be, is
Yeah.
there something you would like to?
Oh yeah, sure.
Because I thought, again, some people may know it, some people won't, and to have a bit of it read by you would be a really, I can hold the microphone.
Sure.
Right.
There's
You say internist.
I wonder if you like this is
Yeah.
Okay, what do you say?
That's
Okay.
great. Take your time.
Okay.
What's the English?
So this is oh yeah. Oh, I'm really sorry. Can you hear? Is that better? Okay. I apologize. So this portion I'm going to read about a page and a half, and it's a description that Paul writes about the experience of working at a summer camp when he is a university student, and he does this thing with his friends where in the middle of the night they go hiking, and so it's sort of this like bravado. It's kind of a bravado machismo thing, but as you can read, or as I'll read to you, Paul's also sort of finding some really beautiful meaning in it too. So he says, nights during a full moon, the light flooded the wilderness, so it was possible to hike without a headlamp. We would hit the trail at 2 a.m., summiting the nearest peak, Mount Talak, just before sunrise, the clear, starry night reflected in the flat, still lakes spread below us. Snuggled together in sleeping bags at the peak, nearly 10,000 feet up, we weathered frigid blasts of wind with coffee someone had been thoughtful enough to bring. And then we would sit and watch as the first hint of sunlight, a light tinge of day blue, would leak out of the eastern horizon, slowly erasing the stars. The day's sky would spread wide and high until the first ray of the sun made an appearance. The morning commuters began to animate the distant South Lake Tahoe roads, but craning your head back, you could see the day's blue darken halfway across the sky, and to the west, the night remained yet unconquered, pitch black, stars in full glimmer, the full moon still pinned in the sky. To the east, the full light of day beamed toward you. To the west, night reigned with no hint of surrender. No philosopher can explain the sublime better than this, standing between day and night. It was as if this were the moment God said, "Let there be light." You could not help but feel your speck-like existence against the immensity of the mountain, the earth, the universe, and yet still feel your own 2 feet on the talus, reaffirming your presence amid the grandeur. Just really like that part.
Thank you, that's great. I think before we go to questions, I thought I'd want to ask you about your writing too, because it's also important to know that at the end of the book this is written a fantastic afterword, and I think the frame of the book, the way it's been edited, put together, the way that you relate the stories when you get to the end and explain it is very moving. Is again one of those dualities of being both a reader and a writer, that you both were reading it as Paul wrote it, but you also then write as well. And again, from your own part of the book, what we might take away, and just any thoughts you have about writing.
So I wrote the epilogue to this book is truly the first thing that I've ever enjoyed writing or felt compelled to write, apart from writing in a patient's chart. I'm able to do that very well and it's organized. But when Paul died, at first it wasn't clear whether the book could still happen. Can you hear? It was, a Word document on his computer, and then we worked very hard to, with the editor, ensure that it became, a real book. And they asked me whether I would like to write an epilogue. And at first I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do that. I'm not a writer. And then I sort of realized, Paul had recorded this this process of dying, and I do feel as if, is this working? I do feel as if he could have written and described his own death, he would have done it. And so that was my first impetus to write the epilogue. And then I saw it as a chance to describe the way in which Paul died, and then sort of reflect upon his life and his death and what the book tells us. So that was how that worked. And I've since learned that, even writers hate writing. And so maybe that makes me a writer.